A good Erev Shabbos. In all the excitement, all that was going on last week, a ceasefire on the Lebanese border, American Thanksgiving, our turkey came out just fine, thanks. I completely forgot to wish you a Chag Sameach. Last Friday was Sigd, the newest national holiday in Israel. It actually fell on Shabbat, but as per custom, its observance was moved back one day so as not to conflict with Shabbos in Israel. What is Sigd, you ask? And why haven't we heard of it? Well, I asked the same question, and I learned a lot from Wikipedia. Sigd is a major Beta Yisrael Chag, a holiday of the Ethiopian Jewish community that came to Israel with those Jews over recent decades since the founding of the state. In fact, since 2008, Sigd has been an official Israeli state holiday. And this year, President Herzog celebrated with the leaders of the Beta Yisrael community. Beta Yisrael is a community of Jews who lived in Ethiopia for most of the last 2,000 years, so they were out of contact with much of Rabbinic Judaism as it developed in the Ashkenazic and Sephardic world. After 1948, they came at different times to Israel, with a very few remaining in Ethiopia and even fewer coming to North America. In the 80s, if you remember, we used to speak about the falasha, which we now understand is a little bit derogatory. It means landless or wanderers, exiles. Also, the related term falash mura seems to refer to Beta Yisrael who converted under pressure from Christian missionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries. So let's say Beta Yisrael. The community obviously has its own long-standing world of observance and custom, authority, and tradition. Beta Yisrael is the name that they self-identify with in the Ge'ez language, which is a South Semitic language that Beta Yisrael uses, although, of course, the 170,000 or so now living in Israel use modern Hebrew. The Beta Yisrael community has as its chumash what you might call a shemuna, a text of 8 books. It's our chumash of Genesis through Deuteronomy, plus the books of Joshua and Judges and Ruth, written in the Ge'ez language. It's pretty compelling that they call it Orit, which means light. The Aramaic term in the Talmud for the Torah is Oraita or Oraisa, which is obviously pretty closely related. You know those Semitic languages. The Beta Yisrael community seemed not to have written much secular literature at all, like, for example, their own history. They kept it as an oral tradition. So in their telling, the origins of their community were in Shevet Dan, the tribe of Dan, who were led southwards, perhaps at the time of the Exodus from Egypt, perhaps by Moshe's sons, Gershom and Eliezer, who, interestingly enough, we never hear about after their birth in the book of Exodus. Another tradition speaks of their origins with Malkat Sheva, the queen of Sheba, mentioned in the book of 1 Kings, Malachim Aleph, and descended from the Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, meaning descendants of Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. Looking at Beta Yisrael life, it's pretty much recognizable to Jewish communities around the world. Kashrut is observed based on what's in those books of Exodus and Leviticus for the most part. The annual cycle of holidays includes Pesach, called Fasika, and Shavuot and Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, mostly called by analogous names. Shabbat is called Sanbat. There's weekly fasting on Monday and Thursday, which, if you look closely in some older versions of our Siddur, you'll find that used to be the case in Europe and in the Sephardic world for centuries. And the synagogue is called Masgid, which sounds a lot like masjid, the Arabic word for mosque, and it comes from the word sagad, which means to bow down or to prostrate oneself, which gives the name of Sigd its holiday. The holiday, the Chag of Sigd, is supposed to be 50 days after Yom Kippur. Originally, it was the 29th of Cheshvan. Again, this year it was moved back to that date so as not to fall out on Shabbat. The origin of the holiday has numerous sources. One says it marks the end of a war between Beta Yisrael and Christian communities in the 6th century. when they went their separate ways. Another says it's actually much later, from the 15th century, and marks an end to Christian persecution of Vayeitzei Yisrael. And yet another source dates it much earlier, saying it's from the times, roughly, of the destruction of the first temple, around the time of Hanukkah. And the Vayeitzei Yisrael would climb a mountain, they would face towards Yerushalayim, the eternal and undivided capital of Israel, and pray that they be allowed to return. According to all the origin stories, the emphasis of the holiday is acceptance of the Torah. The Kahanat, or the clergy of Vayeitzei Yisrael, say that they were the ones who ascended the mountain and prayed to God to inspire the people to keep Haymanot, which is the collective body of laws and traditions, presumably oral for the most part. Rabbi Sharon Shalom is a rabbi in Kiryat Gat in Israel. He was born in Ethiopia, came to Israel when he was a child. He argues that Sigd actually was a Jewish holiday for all Jews once upon a time, but only the Vayeitzei Yisrael has preserved it throughout time. That actually tracks with our study of Talmud tractate Tainus a few years ago, when we came across mention of Megillas Tainus, which a sefer that has been lost in the course of the ages, but held a record of many feast and fast days in the Jewish calendar. So Rav Shalom finds a medrash in Shir Hashirim Rabbah, the midrash on Song of Songs, which says this. This is a quote. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, by rights, the 8th day of assembly, Shmini Atzeret, should have followed Sukkot after an interval of 50 days, like Shavuot follows Pesach. But since at the 8th day of assembly, summer passes into autumn, the time is not suitable for travel. To what can this be compared? A king had several married daughters, some living nearby, others were a long way away. One day they all came to visit their father, the king. The king said, those who are living nearby are able to travel at any time, but those who live at a distance may not be able to travel at any time. So, while they're all here with me, let me make one feast for all of them and rejoice with all of them. So, with regard to Shavuot, which comes when winter's passing into summer, God says the season is fit for traveling. But the Shmini Atzeret comes when summer is passing into autumn and the roads are dusty, hard for walking. It's not separated by an interval of 50 days. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, these are not days for traveling. So while they're here, let us make all of them one festival and rejoice. Therefore, Moshe admonishes Israel, saying to them, on the 8th day you shall have a solemn assembly, as we read in chapter 29 of the book of Numbers. That's the end of the quote from the Midrash. So in summary, Shmini Atzeres should have been celebrated 50 days after Yom Kippur, on the 29th or maybe the 30th of Cheshvan, but it's not practical given the weather. So it's celebrated at the end of Sukkot instead. Still, that 50th day after Sukkot keeps its status as a holiday of acceptance and submission to Torah, or Sigd. That's what it seems. The practice of the holiday is for the Kahen, which there's also a term Kes. I'm not sure the distinction between those two, but it's the clergy in this community. They fast and say Tehillim, and back in the Al Tahaim in Ethiopia, they would climb up the mountains, probably to recall how they escaped persecution. They would read from the Orit, the Vayeitzei Yisrael edition of the Torah. There's breaking the fast, there's dancing, there's Simcha. Sounds a good bit like Simcha's Torah, in fact. So first of all, since all this is going on in Israel, it's worth it for us to know what's happening. We buy that big wall calendar every year that we hang up in the office, and we use it to schedule all the Kiddush sponsorships and the events. And at a certain point in the last few years, they started adding Sigd as one of the important dates on the calendar. So Sigd has definitely arrived. It's worthwhile for us to see how Israel appreciates, or now appreciates, what its diaspora communities bring to the cultural and religious mix of the country. Those of us who originate in Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Poland, Russia, we think that our style and look of Judaism is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's always been this way. You can actually find kids' coloring books in Brooklyn that have Moshe Rabbeinu wearing a shtreimel and white socks, because obviously, right? Moshe Rabbeinu is gegangen on a shtreimel. That view, our view, is now referred to as the Ashkenormative worldview, as if the whole world always grew up eating kneidlach and kugel, or kigel. But it ain't necessarily so. Jews from the whole Sephardic world, from Iraq and Afghanistan to Morocco and Tunisia, brought a whole universe of language, music, customs, practices, and attitudes to Israel. There was a pretty infamous attempt on the part of the powers that be, in other words, Ashkenazic guys, to discourage, shall we put it gently, all the religious and cultural riches that Jews from Yemen brought with them. It is not the most glorious chapter in Israel's history. Perhaps nowadays Israel is learning from its past, and rather than trying to erase or assimilate what immigrants bring, they rather integrate and celebrate it, lift it up, and make it part of the fabric of Israeli life. That's a positive thing. And who doesn't like one more holiday? There's of course discrimination that Vayeitzei Yisrael face, because those of us with light skin have a bad habit of making things harder for people with darker skin. There's a long way to go yet. Maybe it's a sign of good intentions that Israel celebrates Sigd as a nation, not just for a sub-community. Whenever we, our Shul people, volunteered in Israel, we've seen Vayeitzei Yisrael soldiers serving alongside everyone else. We've not seen the economic and educational discrimination that this community faces. Nevertheless, Israel has been called one of the world's most successful multi-ethnic democracies, and with good reason. It's truly a mosaic of various religions, peoples, languages, and communities, and in its very short 76 years has come a long way to be the economic and educational and scientific and innovative and cultural and religious powerhouse that it is. Let's hope that what racism and discrimination remains toward Mizrahi Jews, Vayeitzei Yisrael Jews, Temani Jews, and others who really and truly form the majority of Israeli society becomes less a problem, more of a challenge to be addressed and built upon. Hopefully, any day now, the war will end and the hostages will return home and the rebuilding of Israeli society can begin, and we'll all be asked to pitch in. Hopefully, we'll do so with energy, with dedication, and with love. A good Shabbos.